For many of us, we want a bargain when we're shopping, but how often do we think about the human cost to make things so cheaply? Chances are something you're wearing, using, or touching was made in China by enslaved, tortured workers as they toil under brutal conditions.
They don't have access to medical care, and some people end up dying in these facilities and getting buried in unmarked graves.
Journalist Amelia Pang puts a face on the Chinese who work in bondage in her book, Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods.
All of these labor camps are mostly extra-legal detention centers where the people detained have not had a trial.
It's a 1 in a million chance to be the recipient of a message in a bottle.
In 2012, Oregon mom Julie Keith opened a package of Halloween decorations bought from Kmart to find a letter hidden inside.
Thousands of people here are under the persecution of the Chinese government party.
It was written by a political prisoner forced into one of the most feared labor camps in China, Xinjiang, some 6,000 miles away. In a mix of Chinese and English, the writer pleads for help.
He basically tells her that he has to work 15 hours a day. He's paid roughly $1 a month to work 15 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Julie wanted to make sure the letter wasn't a hoax and shared it on social media and with the press. Her story went viral, bringing awareness to human rights groups and journalists like Pang. The author traces the life of the prisoner and through a remarkable turn of events is later identified as Sun Yi, seen here in a documentary he filmed in between his time spent in labor camps in an effort to expose the conditions.
这是马森家教养院，投放求救信也是在这里发生的。
The former engineer refused to renounce his religious and political beliefs and endured many months of torture and starvation for not falling in step with the Communist Party.
I went to China to verify whether these camps really existed or not, and they did.
As Pang tells Sun Yi's story in her book, Made in China, we learn how our quest for a bargain, even for cheap goods, can cost lives. Amelia Pang, welcome, and we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to remind our viewers and our listeners on our podcast that you can pick up Amelia's book, Made in China, signed copies at Left Bank Books in St. Louis. And the full title is actually Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Amelia, the story is amazing. You follow, as we mentioned in our opening, Sun Yi, who is imprisoned in a labor camp. But before we get into that story, that amazing connection that he has with a woman from Oregon, of all places, and how they become unlikely activists, let's talk about your background, because it is pertinent to maybe why you wrote the book and just what you've learned about yourself as well as an author. You've lived in the United States your whole life. You have Chinese and Uyghur descent. Now, it's an ethnic group I'm not as familiar with, and Uyghur is actually spelled U-I-G-H-U-R, so it looks nothing like it sounds. Please explain what your journey has been.
Yes, my grandmother was Uyghur, and the Uyghurs are a Turkic minority group that live in Xinjiang, China. And unfortunately, there are about 1.5 to 3 million Uyghurs currently detained in concentration camps called re-education camps. And in a lot of these camps, they have to do forced labor. They're manufacturing all kinds of products that are being exported to the US and around the world. And some of these products include PPE equipment, the raw materials for solar panels, and even the hair extensions that have gotten pretty popular these days.
So why is the Chinese government targeting this particular ethnic group? And well, it's not only them. You write about Falun Gong, am I saying that right?
Yes.
That is a religious group who really took hold in China, and which Sun Yi was a member of. So anybody who had practiced any kind of religious affiliation was a member of the Uyghurs, and who else would be maybe taken away to a labor camp?
Oh, there's so many different groups. There's pro-democracy activists. you're hearing a lot about the Hong Kong pro-democracy activists getting arrested and sentenced to prison. And in most of those facilities, you do have to do manufacturing work. There are underground Christians, there are Tibetans, there are civil rights lawyers who try to defend these people, often get detained themselves. All of these labor camps are mostly extra legal detention centers where the people detained have not had a trial, they don't have access to lawyers, and they're just kind of arbitrarily put there indefinitely, and they have to do grueling manufacturing work for 15 to 20 hours a day. They're often tortured, they don't have access to medical care, and some people end up dying in these facilities and getting buried in unmarked graves. And during the last years of their lives, they're doing manufacturing work, making a lot of our cheap goods.
You talk about at the end of the book, and we'll get to maybe what we can do as the individual person, because Julie Keith is a really good example of what one person can do, and so is Sun Yi. So together they created quite the change. So let's go back to the beginning and to your book where you start, to 2010. So Julie Keith, just a mom, to have daughter's 5-year-old's going to have a birthday party, and it's around Halloween. So she goes up into a storage area, digs out these decorations that are now 2 years old and never been opened. So now we know 2 years has passed since she purchased these at a Kmart. And then can you pick up the story from there, that initial find?
Yes, she's, actually the Halloween decorations were gifted to her by somebody who had purchased them on clearance one year. They were just too cheap to pass on, one of those bargain deals after Halloween clearance sales. But nobody really needed this product, and it was given away, and Julie Keith even forgot that she even had it. And it just sat in her storage for 2 years. I just really want to emphasize how trivial this product was, how unnecessary it was. And when she finally remembered to open it, and she's tearing open the cellophane and pulling open the packaging waste, an SOS letter falls out, and it's just kind of folded in a very small way, and really she almost missed it. But her 4-year-old daughter saw that and asked her, "Mommy, what does this say?" And she read it, and she was horrified to realize this was an SOS letter that's written by the political prisoner who had made and packaged this very product in a labor camp in China. So my book tells his story, how he landed in a labor camp, what happened to him in the end. But it also zooms out to look at the deep problems in our supply chain and the really flawed ways that a lot of corporations are auditing their Chinese suppliers. And more importantly, what we can do about it as consumers. What are the steps that we can take to really decrease the amount of forced labor goods that are coming into our stores and our homes?
So let's talk about that then, because, well, for one thing, it wasn't lost on us, the reader, when the irony and of her finding these graveyard stones. So, like, you put them in your front yard and create this Halloween scenario, right? So here's that she's got these graveyard stones, yet the prison or forced labor camp where Sun Yi was really became, as you mentioned, a graveyard for so many. So, and just working on that meaningless piece of decoration, what he went through for maybe sometimes 15 hours a day with dye all over them, their conditions, they would maybe shower once a month. Please describe these conditions so our listeners will get a better idea and at least tease them a little bit about what they'll find in the book. And it's necessary to your story because it is inhumane.
Yes, it's very grueling working conditions. These camps were based off of Soviet gulags in the earliest days. So there's a lot of torture that happens. A lot of the people detained are political dissidents that the government wants to silence and kind of hide from society. And, and the working conditions are just awful. They don't really have any protective gear. The dye that they used to dye the tombstones were just all over the floor. They were just standing in pools of black dye for most of the day, and their feet would just be in standing in this wet dye, and and their hands often got injured from working such long hours, and not really having any protective gloves to wear. And it's an incredibly toxic smell that had a dizzying effect on the forced laborers. You know, and on top of that, if they didn't renounce their religion or their political ideology or their pro-democracy activism, then they had to be taken away to be tortured in a torture room, and held in isolation. So these are under very disturbing circumstances that our Halloween decorations are made.
Yes, and you describe in great detail Suni's own words about what he went through in terms of really being almost put up like a cross in one of these torture rooms and just hung there for days and days. How he lived, Amelia, is truly a miracle. I don't know, because it's just brutal to read it. You think, how do you get that fortitude? And that's a whole nother mindset that you describe in there. Now, when you didn't get a chance to talk to Suni, but you were able to gather this information through other witnesses that you did interview, and he did end up doing a film, which we'll talk about in a minute. But talking to these and women too, oh, just some of the horrors they went through.
Yeah, well, I did interview Suni on Skype, but I
Oh,
didn't
you
get a
did?
chance to
Okay, I apologize.
meet him in person, um, before his story took a tragic turn.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, although the women do undergo worse conditions than the men, a lot of the times there's a lot of sexual violence, sexual torture, very disturbing things.
Right.
And it's still happening today. I mean, the BBC recently published a very damning expose about the prevalence of the sexual violence in the Uyghur camps, that the women go through.
Let's go back to the Uyghurs. So, what is China's goal in all of this? They want the Uyghurs to to denounce their heritage and their culture and say they're Chinese. Is that what they want?
Yes, I know it sounds so strange living in a multicultural country like the US, but uh, China has a one-party rule, and they care very much about having a very strong national and even single ethnic identity. Um, the Chinese policymakers have said that they want to create a single state race, to form this kind of cohesion and just unilateral support for the Chinese Communist Party. And uh, how the Uyghurs are, well, they're not Chinese, strictly speaking. They're Turkic people. They're Central Asians. Oh,
I was going to ask you, when you say, I was confused. Is that like part of Turkey or not related at all?
they are close relatives to the
Okay.
Turks in Turkey.
Okay.
Um, so genetically and physical appearance wise, that they look more Turkish than they do East Asian at all. Yeah. But they're a Central Asian group of people, and then so China has really taken over their land. It said it's theirs. But Xinjiang, where they live, is in northwestern China, and that was the part of the ancient Silk Road route. So it's a huge, it's an area of huge trade importance. China has invested $1 trillion in revitalizing essentially the modern Silk Road, and through what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And this particular economic development strategy really connects China to countries all over the world. But Xinjiang is a huge transportation hub for the Belt and Road Initiative due to its strategic location. Being in northwestern China, Xinjiang connects China to Europe, it connects China to the Middle East, and it also connects China to Central Asia. So it connects China to a lot of trading partners, and it's almost too big to fail. And the Chinese government is terrified of an uprising there that could somehow interfere with their trade. So a lot of people believe that's the reason for the what sparked the massive amount of arrests of Uyghurs, to really control that region and not have any protests erupt, and to not have anything that could potentially damage trade.
Right. And it's always about money and power. That's what they want. They want to be the economic superpower That's the ultimate goal, correct?
Yes, definitely a economic superpower, a global superpower.
Right. Uh, why is it so difficult for, uh, I mean, I guess even a US company doing business there to get a true audit or a relative to come in? I mean, we hear when you wrote about Sunyi's relatives and how difficult was it to get to see him. Frustrating. I mean, I was crying with, the family wanting them to get in to see their brother or their son. It was awful. I mean, because this is the guy who's really plucked out of because he was practicing his religion. I mean, another officer can say, okay, he's practicing, and he goes. It can be pretty arbitrary.
Absolutely, it is very sudden and arbitrary. A lot of times, the family doesn't even know where their family members disappeared to. They may not find out for a long time.
So back to my question, I apologize, I went off a tangent, but let's talk about the auditing. I mean, maybe if you got in a factory, which I know you tried to do, and you did uh, publish some, you went to Shanghai and other places in China and your research for the book. Why is it so difficult to get in? Is they just keep up putting roadblocks and roadblocks, or will you never get a true story?
The current way that a lot of companies are auditing their factories is very flawed. Um, you know, auditors have told me a lot of times these audits are designed to protect the corporation in case a scandal happens, rather than the actual workers. It's not really designed to actually detect something like secret subcontracting to forced labor. For example, when the SOS letter came out, when the news broke and it went viral, the Kmart released a statement, said, "Oh, we conducted an audit and we found no evidence that forced labor was used." But and to the unknowing consumer or reader, that may sound like a perfectly good response. It may sound like Kmart did everything they could to investigate, but what my research really found was that not all audits are made equal, and it's no longer good enough for a company to just say we conducted an audit, we found nothing, and that's the end of the story. Because that's not the end of the story. How much did you actually pay for that audit? A standard audit that costs a couple $100 might only detect simple things like the cleanliness of the factory, or how well the products are made, or how well the equipment is functioning. They don't really check for things like if the workers are okay, or if there's something as complex as hidden subcontracting to another factory that they're not supposed to be subcontracting to. Then you have more expensive audits that cost $1,000 or more, that do interview the workers, and it's more about their working conditions. But even Chinese auditors said even those audits cannot detect hidden subcontracting to labor camps and prison camps, because that's just, it's a very convoluted system. That audit just doesn't have the ability to detect that. And then you have these $5,000 audits that take 5 days to do. And then you have the auditor really go in and they cross-analyze all the wage documents across multiple departments in the factory. And that's how you can maybe tell if there was some illegal and secret subcontracting happening in that factory. But how many corporations are doing those kinds of audits? That kind of information is rarely revealed.
You're not talking about one or two factories. You're talking about thousands, correct?
Yes, I mean, there are thousands of labor camps.
And that's what's so
Millions
scary.
of people detained in them. And, Chinese factories have a lot of places to illegally subcontract work to.
So you're talking about literally this Sunyi, when he goes in, he is sleeping in these bunks, these beds that with other men. I mean, like foot to head, that kind of thing. They weren't allowed to bathe except once a month. I mean, the conditions were nasty, and I'm being kind by saying that. Horrible, just absolutely horrible. So here I am, I'm going to the store, or even ordering online. And it's interesting, I'm seeing more people, at least on social media, asking, like on Facebook, let's say you see an ad come up, where is this product made? And I see more and more of that. And if they do say China, people will move on. That's one minimum thing we can do, because we don't know what the conditions were. So what do you advocate for us to do?
Yes.
Amelia?
What Made in China is ultimately about is educating consumers how to read these sustainability reports on your favorite company's websites. For example, the next time you go shopping online at your favorite store, just take a moment to look at their sustainability page or their corporate social responsibility page and see what it says, or see how little it says. Does it say what kind of audits they're conducting? Does it say how much they're paying their auditors to look at these factories? Does it say how much they're paying the factories? Are they paying the factories enough money to realistically make these products? Or do the factories have no choice but to outsource work to forced labor? And do they even give the factories enough time to make the product?
So when I see that label, or I know that those companies do that, should I just boycott them and not go? And if I do that, what does that mean for those workers in China?
I don't know if there is a company that can guarantee they're not using forced labor due to the lack of transparency in most companies' business practices. So we as consumers have to start demanding from our favorite brands to reveal more information, to really start taking transparency seriously. Let's call this transparency 2.0.
They did through other administrations as well, but most recently, they've done a couple things. In 2019, they imposed some restrictions, visa restrictions on Chinese officials that they believe that the United States believed to be responsible for and being complicit in these detention centers. So that was a start. That's got to be, especially against the Muslims in Xinjiang. It also blacklisted more than 2 dozen Chinese companies linked to abuses in that area. So at least there was an awareness. Then in June of 2020, President Trump signed legislation that also got great support from Congress, mandating that individuals face sanctions for oppressing the Uyghurs, the Turk group that we were talking about. So there are some laws that have come out of this. Do you feel like that's a start, that this is in the right direction because there's awareness out there?
Yes, there's definitely starting to be more awareness and we're starting to see some positive steps with the US government. The US government also recently banned all tomato and cotton products from the Xinjiang region, which is, heavily associated with Uyghur forced labor. And that's a pretty significant, that was the first ban of its kind to just ban entire entire type of product from one region, and so that was a pretty significant development. But there's still a lot of products coming out of Xinjiang and coming out of unfortunately factories throughout China that are associated with Uyghur forced labor. There's so many Uyghurs detained at the moment that there's not enough camps in Xinjiang to hold all of them. So China has created what's called the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program. And between 2017 and 2019 alone, 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred to various factories throughout China, making all kinds of products.
Thank you for shedding a light that we can help others, that we can be like Julie Keith or like you. And even though we think we're just one voice can really do a lot to change things. If you want to find out more, read Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Amelia Pang, thank you so much for doing this research and making it easy to follow and to understand, and telling us and guiding us on what we can do.
Thank you so much to the St. Louis County Library for having me. Local libraries are so important to the communities, and so are the bookstores. So I really want to encourage everyone to support their libraries and support their bookstores, like the Left Bank bookstore. Yeah.
You bet. You can get a signed copy there too. So go visit Left Bank Books in St. Louis. Again, Amelia Pang, thank you so much.